everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today we're gonna be doing my second soft pastel piece. I wanted to show you guys the process for this because I really liked how this one turned out, and I will also be reviewing another soft pastel set later on. And before that, I wanted to get to know the medium more, and I also will be talking about some tips that I have learned along the way. I know I haven't done many soft pastel pieces, but I have learned a lot of things from those few pieces that I've done. So before we get to anything, I wanted to talk about the materials I used for this piece, and the most important one is my Paul Rubens soft pastel portrait set, and I will talk more about this set in particular later on in the video. And the paper that I used is actually watercolor paper. This one is pure cotton paper. It's Fabriano Artistico. And the last thing that we're gonna need is this fixative spray. This one is from Q-Lox, and that is basically it. It's what I used for this piece. And so moving on to the process, and also the very first tip that I have is to always go bigger if you can. Because of the soft and crumbly nature of soft pastels, it's going to be really hard to get very fine details on a very small piece. And so this one actually turned out to be one of my biggest pieces. It's 22 over 16 inches, and all of those inches were really needed for me to get this much detail into the piece. And even looking at the final product, it's not a very detailed artwork when you really think about it. So the bigger you can get your piece to be, the better. It's just going to be an easier process for later on. And then the second tip that I have is to make sure that the line work is clean. So most of the prep work that I actually did for this drawing was very similar to how I did my bigger watercolor pieces. So I had to stretch my watercolor paper for this because it was so big, and I also had to make sure that I did the line work digitally, so when I transfer it over to my paper, it's clean and there's not a lot of smudges to confuse me when I start. And you can see what I'm doing right now is the background first. So another tip that I have is to work in similar values. So since this piece in particular has very strong divide between the dark background and the lit up subjects in the foreground, I worked on both of them separately. So I did the background first since there's a lot of darker colors in here that I didn't want to touch the rest of the painting, so I did that first. And then also just made sure to smudge this properly. It was so satisfying to do this, by the way. I did just use my hands because it's just easier for me to gauge the amount of pressure that I need to smudge everything in. I just use my fingers that way. And this is also just one of the more satisfying parts to this process, is seeing how beautiful and how intense these colors are once you smudge it out, because you can't really see it at first when you lay them down because the paper is very rough. And so yeah, I did the background first. But the other tip that I have is to use the spray between layers. So after I did this background, I sprayed it with my fixative spray. So when I work on them on the foreground, that dark color isn't going to be touching the background. There isn't going to be much contamination between the two colors. So spray in between layers. You wouldn't want to touch each other, most especially dark and light colors. It's going to help a lot with the process later on. And so the very next one is to choose your colors properly. And for this artwork, it's mostly a credit to the set that I have. And I've talked about how much I love the color options for this set, and it's just so well crafted how they chose these colors. There's colors here that I would associate with especially natural lighting in skin tones, that I just really love this set so much. It's not something that you would see normally, even in bigger color option set. They don't normally have these colors with them. So one of the more important things, and I guess this is another tip to add on, is choose your colors properly, because as beautiful as I think this turned out, most of it is really the colors that I had to work with. And the portrait looks beautiful because I had the exact colors that I needed to get the look that I wanted. And also, when you do have those colors, make sure to place them well before smudging them out. because those are just very important to try to work in even the slightest color shift that you see and put that in your work. It just makes the whole process easier when you blend them out. And you can see just all come together even in the first few layers in the painting. Even with the painting looking like this right now, I was already really proud of it, and you could already see that I was gonna enjoy this process a lot. And so the next thing that I did, and you can see it here, is spray in between layers altogether. So whenever I felt lost in the piece and didn't really know how to proceed or to add more layers, I would just spray the whole thing just so I can get a more even base to add my softer layers on. Because of how soft pastels are, you would need them to be mostly set before you add extra layers on top, and so that's why you see me spraying in between layers too. And I think that's a very important part of the process, and again, something that I learned while doing this one piece. I think I did do that before, but it wasn't as religious about using the fixative spray as I am now. And the next tip I have is to work slowly and add as many nuanced colors as you can, because of how beautifully soft pastel blends. When you do blend it out, it's going to look natural and beautiful, and also it will still have that soft, realistic look that I associate a lot with the medium of soft pastels. And so as I'm adding in this many layers on top of each other, the next tip that I have, which actually should be the very first one, is to choose rough papers. And that's why I did choose this watercolor paper, because it really holds on to the pastels. When it's something that's very soft and finely milled like this, you really need paper that has a lot of tooth and can hold on to the pastels. Because if you've worked with soft pastels at all, it's a very chalky, very soft consistency that even a slight breeze can blow some of the thicker texture out. So yeah, use a rougher watercolor paper if you can, and cold pressed watercolor paper is the best because it has that rough tooth. And also because you're going to be spraying a lot in between, it should be able to hold the consistency of the spray without the paper warping. I did still have a little bit of warping for my watercolor paper, but I mostly blame that on me not stretching it out properly. I mostly just flattened mine without really thinking about stretching it out properly, and that's why it's a little bit of warping on the edges, but not as much as if I had used a thinner paper. The next tip that I have is very important, and this is another thing that I learned while doing this particular piece, is to smudge or blend it out with your fingers or whatever you use to blend out your soft pastels, but blend it out after you spray it too, because if you guys have noticed, after I spray my layers, they sort of have this more flat look to the colors. They sort of look more even, and that's why I avoided spraying so much before, because I didn't like that look for my soft pastels. But something I learned after is to simply just blend it out after each spraying session, so it just reawakens the colors underneath. It does make them less secure, but it makes the colors more vibrant. You can even see in the background later on in the video that the dark background looks darker and richer. That's because I blended it out with my fingers after I've sprayed it. And the very last tip that I have is to save the details for the very end. To do all the building up in values, to do the form building before you do the details, because when you do try to add the details in the beginning, there's a bigger chance of it getting smudged up, and when you spray in between, you're not going to be able to fix those details. So just try to do that towards the very end, especially with a piece like this where there's a very deep separation between the colors I have for them versus the background. Whenever I would start to add something like hair strands over the dark background, and I didn't end up loving it. Since I already sprayed over it, there was no way for me to fix that, so I had to deal with some of it for later. But yeah, just try to save the details for right where you think you're about to end. I think it also makes the process more satisfying in that way. There is a little extra tip that I have, and this is mostly for personal look, so you guys don't have to follow this one, but it's to embrace the look that you can get with the soft pastels and not to add too many extra details, because that's one thing I had to learn from this piece. I did try to use my colored pencils over them for some of the hair strands, but I really disliked the look. Those sharper details, those very clean, sharp details on top of the very soft look that I got with most of the piece, they just looked really out of place, and I didn't end up loving them. And so that's just a more personal thing that I liked, is to embrace the look that I can get with soft pastels and to just go with that throughout the whole piece and not to overdo it. And I even played around with the softer, with sort of the blended out details on the guy's face, Mr. Knightley. I made sure that his face is almost off focus and in shadow, so our eyes are drawn more to Emma. And it's also like that with the lighting. Light is almost just falling on her, but you can still see him. And to just balance everything out, I just had the candles lit up behind him, so the whole thing still looks balanced and beautiful. But yeah, that is really it for all of my tips on how to work with soft pastels. If you guys learned anything, please let me know in the comments. I really loved how this one turned out, and it's so big, so I'm so excited to maybe frame it and put it on my wall. It will only be my second piece that I have framed and displayed in our house, so I'm really excited for how this one turned out. It's also of a scene from one of my more favorite movies, Emma. Thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you to my patrons for supporting me. I will be seeing you guys again soon.